Welcome everyone to the 2020 Benjamin Mays debate. I want to start everyone for thanking them for being here this afternoon, in particular Daniel and Caleb, who have come here from Morehouse College to debate. My name is Peter, and I'm the convener for the debate team. We are gathered here for a few reasons. One reason is to honor Dr. Benjamin Mays, who links Bates and Morehouse College together. Dr. Mays attended Bates College, debated while he was here, and graduated in 1920. In 1940, he became president of Morehouse College, where he helped guide the institution for 27 years. Dr. Mays served as an intellectual father and spiritual mentor for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Morehouse graduate. On MLK Day, we remember the sacrifices and heroics that have helped build a better and more equitable society. Yet, as I'm sure you've heard from the talks and presentations throughout today, racism, sexism, intolerance, and institutional barriers are still rampant throughout society. Much like those who have come before us, we face questions of how to change society for the better. Should we fight for sweeping changes, or should we chip slowly back at oppression? That brings us to today's debate. This House believes that social movements should propose policies that radically reimagine society rather than prioritizing incremental change. Before we begin, I want to quickly explain how this debate's going to unfold and introduce our debaters. On my right is the government team. They will be presenting arguments in support of the resolution. On my left is opposition. As you might expect, they will be arguing against the motion. The debate will begin with Prime Minister Daniel giving a speech which builds the government's case. The leader of opposition, Sam, will respond to the government's case by countering their points and building his own arguments. Then we'll have the member of government, Lillian, rebut the opposition and rebuild government's own arguments. The member of opposition, Caleb, will come and do essentially the same thing. At this point, we'll take a break and ask for audience questions for a few minutes. These questions can be general or directed to one of the teams. Then Daniel and Sam will give two final speeches where they try to respond to as many questions from the audience as possible and explain why their side won this debate. A few final notes on the quirkiness of this style of debate. During the speeches, a member from the other team might stand up to ask a question. The speaker can pause and let the other member ask the question, or they can wave them down. This is not rude, it's merely a quirk of the debate. Additionally, if the speaker says something you agree with, you can tap your leg or your chair to show your support. This is the debate's way of clapping, so to speak. Finally, the scope of this debate is set to the United States. Because of time restrictions, this is done to help the debaters build more nuance into their arguments. Without further ado, I invite Daniel to build a case in support of the motion. This House believes that social movements should propose policies that radically reimagine society rather than prioritizing incremental change. Thank you.
Before I begin, as is customary in debate, I'd like to extend the warmest of thank yous and the utmost gratitude from myself, Caleb, and everybody else at Morehouse College, including the debate team. The warmth and hospitality that you have shown each and every one of us has been incredible, and this is one of the greatest opportunities that Morehouse debaters have in their careers. So thank you for that. And with that, let's get started. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it has wholly diverged from the path of the poor, the workers of this country, Black America, the LGBT community, and those who occupy the margins of society, a society pillaged by capitalism and white supremacy, which is why we are proud to argue in proposition of this resolution, that social movements should propose policies that radically reimagine society rather than prioritizing incremental change. The proposition in today's speech is going to give you a few things. Firstly, the principal assertion that we uphold in today's debate. Secondly, how social movements function, where we need radicalism, and finally, closing out with where radicalism works, all to answer the fundamental question of how do we contend with a radically unequal society. Firstly, on the principal assertion, we believe that in a radically unequal world that we need to be radical in our response, and that the incrementalism that the opposing team is going to advocate for is an abdication of each and every one of our duty to speak truth to power and uphold the basic protections that our fellow men and women are owed in today's society. Now, as for how social movements function, in order to understand this, we have to understand how policy functions in the current era. We believe that social movements are the counterbalance of the marginalized to policy within the modern era. But policy is best defined by Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey in their book, The Undercommons. And they say that policy is the demonstration of the will to contingent and the willingness to be made contingent, i.e. the incrementalism of policy deciding who deserves the bare minimum when. And so, in reaction to this policy mandate, we see that social movements have their refuge in the radical. The idea that political advocacy, things like March for Our Lives, as well as student committees like SNCC and CORE from the Civil Rights Movement, have a means of taking marginalized individuals and giving them the power to advocate for policy that represents them. Furthermore, we believe that it is the vein of fugitive planning that makes places like Morehouse possible, right? This idea that individuals are existing in educational institutions able to achieve some level of upward mobility due to the culmination of prayers of ancestors who were enslaved, as well as relatives who lived through segregation and Jim Crow. The idea that our story and that historical canon is intrinsically evolving. But we also believe, finally, that it is a springboard for change. And that brings us to where we need radicalism today. And we need radicalism to combat the modern era of slavery, segregation, and for-profit exploitation under the framework of capitalism. We believe that it's a proposition that we are much better off advocating for policies that wholly abolish police and the white supremacist state as we know it, abolishing prisons and ending the legacy of incarceration that has pillaged communities of color in this country, as well as advocating for policies to give everyone in this country a basic means of living sustainably through Medicare for each and every member of this country. But then we also believe that ending the educational and housing segregation rather than incrementally modifying the conditions of oppression is what we should all advocate for. We believe, I'll take you at the end of this, we believe that we are better to aim to shed the chains of our oppression completely and fail in that continued fight rather than to modify our bondage and claim an easy victory. Caleb.
At the point at which we desire these radical ends, how do we, with these policies in which you're preferring, deal with the backlash that occurs in the status quo as we're making those changes before we receive that end?
Well, we understand that we live, as minorities and fugitive individuals, we live a life of consistent backlash. We believe that the backlash that exists currently is one based on the inherent otherization of people within the status quo. The idea that people are enslaved within the prison system now because of a backlash that exists on the fundamental sin but considered by white America that is blackness in this country. So we say that it's better to face backlash and actually go somewhere and actually advocate for something rather than to incrementally change the conditions of our oppression and claim an easy victory. So when it comes to police and prison, we believe that we should abolish these institutions because of the Justice Department statistics that came out in 2019 that revealed black and brown individuals living in human squalor. We believe that we should abolish the police that murdered 933 people in 2019 alone, because as Deshaun Harrison, a Morehouse alum, states, that the entire system of policing is predicated on the very existence of the slave, the criminal, and the creation of borders as a means to further criminalize the slave, right? So where has radicalism worked in the past? We believe that radicalism was incredibly successful during the abolitionist movements of the 1800s, like the Secret Six and the Harper's Ferry Rebellion, but then we also believe that it can work in the current era, pointing to other examples in, say, Chiron, Mexico, that kicked out a whole corrupt class of logger industries individuals as well as corrupt police and a political class to preserve the sanctity of their community, right? And so, in closing, I guess the best idea to close with is the idea of Theodore Parker, the theologian who was first credited with the idea of the moral arc of the universe. And we say that insofar as that moral arc of the universe has radically diverted from the direction of working people, the poor, and those within the margins, we must radically act to counteract that. Thank you.
Hello? great. Can try not to blow out your ears with the speech, first and foremost. But also something we need to say is extend thanks right back to Morehouse, because it has been a long journey for them, a long trip to come up here and to debate with us is an honor to be a part of this, and for them to be here is even more so. So I want to thank them very much for being here, as well as all else who have worked on this project to make this possible. So, on opposition, we provide to you a different perspective. We use the quote of MLK when he famously said, "If you cannot fly, then run. If you cannot run, then walk. And if you cannot walk, then crawl." We think that we may have the same principles as they propose on side government, but the way that we get there is one that increases the humanity that we have, protects those within our own movements, and gets to where we're going quicker and more efficiently. We think it only appears natural to want to address issues of extreme injustice with extreme solutions. But on opposition, we think that ultimately, if we're not protecting those that are involved in our movements, then we're not doing our job first and foremost. I want you all to imagine something for me on the principle of our argument. That is, imagine that you were Martin Luther and you were bringing people across the bridge in Selma, knowing that there was violence on the other side. The issue is that you need to be sure that on the other side there is more humanity, on the other side you'll be getting change, on the other side you will increase people's humanities and not decrease what they have come to already escape. At that point then, I think the courage that it takes is uncountable insofar as it means that you need to have an idea of what you're looking for. We think that ultimately we can have the same goals as side government proposes. We can have extremely proud principles that allow us to increase people's humanities, but we think it is ultimately the case that you need to have concrete goals that you can propose and allow for people on the margins to benefit from. So we think then the first thing we need to say is that you need to be protective of those who are involved in your society. Using the most radical ideas, as pointed out in the POI by my partner, will often lead to the harshest backlash. This is important because it's likely those in power who have the easiest ability to say things that are radical, but those that are most on the margins are the ones who are affected most by the backlash. That means when we are leading movements, when we are involved in social movements, we need to be protective of those who don't have as much rights as we do. More on that later. The second point we want to bring to you is about feasibility. It's about how we get from point A to point B. Because we think that ultimately, in 2019 and 2020, our social movements are more diverse, more intersectional, and more widespread than they've ever been in the past. That means that when we have these widespread principles, it is often the case that we leave those behind with which we do not share common experiences. But this is unacceptable in 2020, and it will be unacceptable far and into the future. So when we have issues of intersectionality, it is easier to work on them if we use small, concrete goals. I'll give you an example. Voting has been a contentious issue in the history of our country as long as we can remember. And each incremental change in voting came with an incremental backlash that made each policy more difficult. If we were to jump to the conclusion that we were just going to do what is most principled and what we think will do the most good, we will likely face more backlash than we would like to otherwise. We think at that point then, you want to have smaller goals which are going to allow you to get more concrete change that will benefit the people that are in the movement themselves. I'll take your question if you still have it.
So my question centers around the acts of the Boston Vigilance community led by Theodore Parker, right? In reaction to slavery, they created radical policy to let fugitive slaves escape. So if radicalism worked during the vices of slavery, then why is incrementalism suddenly our answer now?
And we think that the principle holds, which is that we need to have principles that are radical, but the way that we go about them is critical. Note the point that I brought you earlier, which is that those who have the most ability to speak out and not be taken back backlash on them are the ones who can do these things, but it is those who don't have it that are not going to be able to benefit from it. The point at which that is the case, we want to involve a third argument here, which is about intersectionality. We think that ultimately when you have leaders of a movement, when you have movements that are widespread and across different nations and places, you need to have the ability to have multiple different policies. If you have one widespread idea, this means all the people are involved in providing that one concept and that one principle. But if you have different policies that can benefit different people, it allows you to involve and consider more policies and more ideas more concretely. That is to say, if we have one large principle, we do often leave people out at the margins. Those people then benefit when we do things incrementally because it allows us to choose battles that we know are going to have the perspective and the understanding of those who only understand their own experiences as they do. When this happens, we think that we ultimately get movements that are going to be more accepting and more involved of people who have different levels of intersectionality, that sexuality and race can work in tandem to create much stronger social movements that are going to put much more pressure on legislatures, on different countries, and across the world to gain allies, to gain concrete success, and to not end up in issues of backsliding and the like. We think that ultimately here, We have similar ground to government when it comes to the principles. It is that we think that radical principles are what we need to reform our society, but extreme actions are not always our first resort insofar as they often hurt those which we don't necessarily consider at the outset. When this happens, we think it doesn't allow these movements to grow to their full potential, to defend the rights and the justice of the most human beings that we can. We think that is ultimately the goal of every social movement. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I'd just like to start my speech by echoing the sentiments of Sam, and thank you so much to Morehouse College for sending two incredible people to accompany us today. And also thank you to all of you who have come out on this incredibly cold day to listen to us talk. So without further ado. This morning, the New York Times published an article about Bighorn County in Montana and revealed that since 2010, 26 Indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered. Autopsies from these murders discovered months ago have yet to be completed, and searches for these victims are predominantly funded by the victims' families. At the point where incremental change, such as additional police training or maybe cultural competency measures, are not going to make the meaningful differences for the people whose survival is currently threatened, we believe that social movements have a principled obligation to advocate for the immediate implementation of radical and often life-saving policies. Firstly, I'm going to talk slightly about what Sam just told you, and then I'm going to go further onto why, if we actually want to see societal change, we have to include radical policies from social movements. Firstly, we get this notion that we have the same ends, but just different ways of getting there. I'm going to tell you exactly why it is that we don't necessarily reach the same ends through incremental change. Secondly, on how we need to increase humanity, we don't think that this is valid at the point where in 2020, not everyone is receiving the equal rights or equal privileges that modern Western media would like you to believe. And lastly, on this idea that when social movements radicalize, we need to protect people in the margins because those are the people who are the most vulnerable. At the point where these people are in the margins and they're not being recognized by the institutions meant to protect them, we have to account for these failures. We believe that politicians are choosing to ignore to see the issues that are in front of them, and therefore it's the obligation of these social movements to radicalize so as to gain visibility within the mainstream so that these problems can actually be addressed. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the existence of these radical policies and how they generate conversation and the potential for engagement on multiple levels. We think that radical policies are incredibly important because they're often the only way to gain traction or excite marginalized groups while also forcing a conversation with moderate individuals. Recognize that in the 2008 election, the Democratic base thought that they needed to have a conservative candidate due to the humiliating loss of John Kerry in 2004. However, he was never able to gain the momentum that a candidate who was radical at the time, such as Obama, was able to because he was able to mobilize people who had previously thought that they didn't have a voice in politics. This energized people who had felt distant, and it raised enough attention from the white-dominated media to see that white people needed to actually listen to the types of changes that this person was advocating for, and that these were real harms that we were ignoring. We think that the existence of these radical messages is essential for igniting actual change, even if the policies themselves are not immediately implemented. We think that the conversation needs to be started, and that the social movements are separate from politics and therefore have a need to have this conversation. So at the point where social movements are able to serve additional purposes that can directly cause policy change, we think that things like advocacy building, which can actually lead to people becoming more involved in politics, is more important. We think that this can only happen with radical reform. Recognize that radicalization of social movements typically only happens from people who have the most to lose. Daniel earlier mentions this on how we live in a radical society because the institutions that we put faith in are not working. We see examples of this in history where radical movements have been more successful. Take, for example, the Black Panther movement, which was able to simultaneously push white conservatives towards MLK while also implementing radical policies that protected Black communities. This was a movement that was able to accommodate multiple types of audiences while still recognizing the interests of one specific group. You had Black Panthers who were arguably scaring away white people from the Black Panther movement, but that forced them to recognize that this was a serious topic that many people were worried about, and therefore they were more willing to listen to someone who was more conservative, such as Martin Luther King. It brought attention and it brought awareness, even if their direct policies were not immediately implemented. However, they would also do things like follow around police officers in Black communities because they had to compensate for the lack of a legitimate police force in these communities and address survival needs simultaneously while bringing this public attention. We think that social movements have a unique unique space in modern day society because they're able to not only enact political change, but also protect people who need the immediacy of it. We want to think of the existence of these radical messages as essential to ignite actual change, because one day people will actually start to have these conversations. Many causes that we consider today in modern politics to be essential to have, such as paid family leave, higher minimum wage, universal health care, these were conversations that were happening 40 years ago that were considered to be wildly radical at the time. We need people to have these conversations because one day, if they are ever to be implemented, people need to start having these conversations now. We recognize that while radical policy is incredibly hard to push, it is something that theoretically should be the end goal. If we both agree that this is the end goal, then social movements should uniquely be the ones to have this conversation rather than politicians. What I want to leave you on is this. It took our illustrious government months to decide whether to ban just fruit-flavored vape pods or just mint. This is an example of how ineffective politics can be and how this is such a red tape situation in modern day society. If we believe that incremental change needs to happen, and it needs to happen in an additive effect such that you can actually see the effects of it, we're going to be waiting forever. That's why we need to have radical movements in order to ignite both the energetics of people who are typically ignored by societal institutions, as well as reminding people of what the eventual future should look like. So for all those reasons, we're incredibly proud to support this motion. Thank you.
Before I begin, I would like to extend my thanks to the people of Bates College. This experience has been one of a lifetime, and I'm incredibly thankful for the relationship between our two institutions, the opportunity to stand before you today. The first thing I want to acknowledge when addressing the arguments brought to you by side government is two major misunderstandings they're having in this round. The first is in the understanding of how policy implication actually works, and the second is the understanding of human behavior on whole. So what exactly does this look like? The first thing we need to address is the understanding of policies. As our motion states today, we're talking about the implementation of radical policies, not simply their idealization as a means of which to achieve. And what do we understand? As Lillian comes up here and tells you, we see that for something as micro as just a jewel pod, our government moves slow. So imagine how slow an already divided government is going to move on a concept such as the abolishment of police. If we want to actually make policies that, as they state, could be necessary for saving lives, we need to make solutions that are most likely to be accepted by those already in power so that we can have the ability to begin to advocate for people who already lack the ability to advocate for themselves. What we tell you is that what we fundamentally understand is that we need to help these people in the most efficient way possible, which is what Sam tells you. It's not simply that we don't desire a radical end, it's simply that we understand that the means of which to achieve it have to be those of which are actually attainable. So what does this look like? Since they've actually invoked the name of King, I'd actually like to use a quote that was actually often spoken by him and other members of the greater civil rights movement, and it's the idea that no man goes to war without counting up his cost. And one of the major things when we address the point Sam gives you on intersectionality is that when we get into discussions of creating radical policy, we often have the ability to leave people behind. So for example, we talk about the Native women who have been abducted in Montana, as Lillian mentions. What we tell you is that a discussion on radical policy looks like radical defense of women on whole, and what that discussion ends up looking like is the protection of all women being human trafficked. But what do we already know about our society? We're already not addressing those people on the fringes, so when the discussion becomes radically about the protection of women on whole, we begin to fail to acknowledge the people who most need it as they're trying to tell you. We tell you that incremental change gives us the ability to actually have discussions and dialogues with people, the ability to communicate and understand what the niche problems are that affect different parts of our population, and ultimately provide us better ways of creating solutions that are not only effective, but also the most timely in being able to protect the most amount of people. Me and Sam don't come up here today to tell you that the system is perfect. In fact, we tell you that it's far from it. What we tell you, though, is that when you operate within a system, you must use its rules to achieve what it is that you desire. And your failure to actually account and interact with these things on-site government is their ultimate downfall today. And when it comes to this idea, they talk about how there's a new role to play for these social movements in the 21st century. What we're ultimately going to tell you, I'll take you in a second, is that what we're looking at is not new. The idea of incrementalism is not new when it comes to dealing with these systems, and they ask why exactly should we really be relying on older systems, and I'll provide it after I take this POI.
So we tell you that when social movements push radical policies, people are more likely to become energized and more likely to become involved in moderate political actions. How will incremental change policies generate similar levels of engagement?
I'm actually glad you brought this up. This was the point I was trying to make on your failure to understand human behavior on whole. The example you give of the Black Panthers actually tells you this idea that people fled from the Black Panther Party and ran right into the arms of MLK movement. But in saying that, you're fundamentally misunderstanding what history actually tells us happened in the greater civil rights movement. What we tell you is that those people didn't flee the Black Panther Party and go to MLK. Rather, they decided that the entire movement of the civil rights on whole was negative and net detrimental because that was their only exposure to those systems. When you create radical policies, all you do is frighten people who already lack an understanding. And if ignorance is such the opponent that you state that it is, we see that you're not truly achieving anything but further otherizing the people you want to bring into your fold. So moving on, the next thing I want to tell you when it comes to the greater civil rights movement is that when we're dealing with things, whether it's going to be issues of feminism, whether it's LGBT, whether it's protection of women, whether it's even the protection of just average people who happen to not have enough money, what we tell you is that any of these systems, despite the fact that they may live in a radical system of oppression, cannot be conquered by radical solutions because people in power will always fear radicalism. And they're going to probably come up here and tell you in their final speech, well, why exactly should we listen to people in power if they don't have our best interests in mind? And what I tell you is the theory of interest convergence, which tells us that when you lack power, you need people who have you. It is the reason that the civil rights movement of the 1950s did not just include poor blacks, it included white people who had access to resources. It is because we don't wish to push away any potential allies that we would never advocate for the type of radicalism that they'll bring you for today. Because what we tell you is that when you push away anyone who has a desire to help you, all you're doing is losing your further ability to advocate for yourself. And the last thing we want to address is they tell you about generating these conversations, and what we tell you is that conversations aren't generated when we fundamentally misunderstand exactly how people are going to interact. It's because people desire radical change that they often fail to consider the actions and what they're doing and the impacts that come from it. So if you are actually desiring a system that will generate change, if you're desiring allyship and you're desiring a better movement for people on whole, I ask that you side with the people who have done what history has proven works in creating change for people, and working in increment and not seeking to topple systems that leave vacuums of social interaction. Thank you.
I would like to thank all four great debaters for great speeches, and now invite if anyone from the audience has questions, ask them. I think we have a few mics that are going around to make it easier to hear. I think we have a question over there.
My question is for the people who are proponents, which is, which I believe you call yourself side government. Okay, side government. Do you think it is possible to have radical policy changes outside a revolutionary context?
Thank you for that question. Does anyone else have a question that they would like answered from one or both of the teams?
Hi, I guess this is for both parties. You both have evoked MLK. It is MLK Day. My question is, what is your reasoning for, do you think that MLK is an incrementalist or a radicalist? From the letters from Morehouse jail, where it's like arguing for radical change, we cannot wait any longer, or other quotes you've used where you must learn to walk before you fly. Which one do you think he is?
Thank you for that question. I think you have a question in the back.
Yeah, for I think it's side opposition, this side. Like, how do you plan to counter divisions within your respective social movements and that happen as a result of like slow social progress, and these things happening incrementally, there can often be like restlessness in communities, especially those marginalized ones who already face like so much division. So how can you counter that from happening and actually hindering the progress of the movement as a whole?
Thank you. Go ahead.
I wonder how the incrementalists think that those who already have power are going to be persuaded to give it up by small incremental changes. To me, we have a lot of experience. We have 150 years of US history to show us how poorly that has worked.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think we can take a few more.
Can either side attempt to define some kind of rubric or framework by which you define what is radical versus what is incremental?
Thank you. I think that'll be it for questions. I invite Daniel to give the final speech of the government side. Thank you.
So in today's debate, I think we've gotten lost in the conversation concerning, one, what really constitutes radicalism and why incrementalism doesn't work. So to both incorporate some of the questions and concerns from the audience as well as to directly conflict with the opposition, we believe that necessarily the crux of this debate centers around the idea that incrementalism is, as I defined earlier, this idea of political apathy and stakeholders defining who deserves the bare minimum when, this idea of modifying the conditions of marginalized people's oppressions to make sure that there's some level of change that the people in power can cite, right? We believe that, this is the fundamental conversation between, the proponents of the Obamacare side of healthcare versus those who argue for Medicare for all within the presidential race today, right? This idea that some people are fine with some level of incremental change to where they can point and say, well, some people have coverage versus those on the radical side of today's debate who state that insofar as individuals in this country are rationing insulin because they can't afford it, insofar as individuals are deciding whether or not to pay medical bills or a light bill or a gas bill, or deciding which check they're going to send to which check they're going to send and which one they can necessarily be comfortable with bouncing back, that's the crux of the radicalism versus incrementalism in today's debate. And we tell you that along the lines of the radicalism that people like Frantz Fanon propose, that the individuals who have the most to lose, the poor of the world, the poor within this country, have the most to lose, and thusly they are the only individuals who can be truly radical. And we believe that it's best to side with these individuals rather than appealing to the nature of fear and incremental change that the opposition would like to appeal to, right? So what do we necessarily get from side opposition in today's debate, right? Caleb gives us a framework that extends on what Sam gives you, this idea that policy works in a way where we have to focus on implementation rather than idealization of policies, right? Because the idea is that we have to cater to our oppressor in order to make sure that some means of policy change can be achieved, right? We believe that we fundamentally reject this notion in today's debate. We believe that appealing to your oppressor is not the best means of creating policy, and the idea that incremental change in itself excites no one in today's debate and excites no one within the policy discussion, right? This idea that when you go into rural Appalachia and tell somebody, well, I can promise you a factory job that may come back, rather than saying everyone in this country should be guaranteed a wage, should be guaranteed a means of living with some level of dignity in this country, we tell you that the latter, the more radical of those policies, excites more individuals and brings more individuals into coalitions in that conversation. But then they also say that we fundamentally misunderstand human behavior. That's kind of sad because that's exactly what they're doing in today's debate, right? This idea that when it comes to human behavior, this idea that somehow, some way, perhaps, if we can just be say to our oppressor, pretty please, if we only can get just a crumb of change, the idea that that is somehow the way in which we create policy. No, we tell you that the only way that you can create policy in response to radical inequality is by shedding the confines confines and chains of your oppression wholly and completely, and in a manner that does not take into account this idea of incremental apathy, right? This idea that radical policy is rejected because individuals are scared from the margins. We tell you that's the exact opposite of what happens, right? Point towards the example of abolition movements that I gave in my first speech, right? This idea of the Secret Six who funded abolition rebellions like the Harper's Ferry Rebellion, had individuals of all races, creeds, and economic backgrounds within their coalition, and they were able to free individuals from the bondage of slavery. This idea that radical inequality necessitates a radical response, and that it's been successful in the past is something that we can directly point to on side government in today's debate, right? Because we tell you that Theodore Parker's Boston Vigilance Committee that helped smuggle freed slaves across the Mason-Dixon line and helped shelter them from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 helped to make sure that all of these slaves but two immediately after that slave act escaped the bondage of slavery. Whereas side opposition would tell you, perhaps we should go to the bargaining table with the Confederate States of America. Perhaps we should bring slaveholders into the conversation because that level of incrementalism is what we need in today's debate. We firmly reject that on side proposition. But then when it comes to the final question in today's debate, this idea that should we have a revolution or should we have advocacy? We believe that anytime you have a situation in which individuals are living in places like Angola Prison within Louisiana, in human squalor and conditions that do not permit them to have the bare minimum of humanity, that radicalism in your response is not something that is to be debated about. It is your requirement as a human being to protect your fellow man, and it is a requirement as a human being to have some level of conscience and morality to deal with the radically unequal world that we're all in. It's a fundamental obligation, not a policy conversation. Thank you.
Great. I want to give one more thank you to Peter and the other people that are involved in this process, the people taking pictures, the one who set up the sound and the live stream. All of this, we couldn't do it without you. I want to thank you for that. I also want to say hi to my parents and family at home. I'm glad that you're watching, and it means a lot. But onto the serious topics. I will do my best to answer every question that was asked. If you don't feel like it was answered, please come talk to me after. We can talk about it. I'd love to discuss it, but I'll do my best to go one by one and talk about these. The first question that I saw that we got was, is MLK an incremental change, or is it a representative? Did he represent principled change? I think this is an important question, and I think that we show you that, yes, he was mostly incremental change. We give you the example in my partner's speech where we tell you that people moved over from other places of radical change to MLK because they recognized that this was the way that they were going to get change and how they would maximize their own humanity in a world that was so dead set on limiting that. At the point in which that is the case, I think you say MLK was based on incremental things. I also want to talk about the quote that we brought up at the beginning of my speech, which is, if you can't fly, you run. If you can't run, you walk. We think that on our side, we better protect those that can only crawl, those that can only do things which are small in their lives to make a difference because of how oppressive their circumstances are. For them, this incremental change is radical. Everything that has changed here is a huge leap in terms of how we treat the people around us. The second thing that I got a question about is how this is divides the people in our own movements. That is to say, if we have changes, not everyone might like them. But I think this actually proves that we might have better movements on our side, which is to say, if the movement that I'm in doesn't propose a policy I like, I'm more likely to move to another movement where even if I agree with the principle that these movements are talking about, I can now see change and see what people at the top are focused on. I can know that my leaders are considering my own issues and start other movements, join with them, and allow myself to work towards that, which is going to be most helpful for myself. The third thing that was asked is, how did they give it up? How do we know the people in power are going to make this change? And I think that's the crux of this round, which is that you don't. Every change in social movements is a leap of faith to recognize that the dehumanization that you are facing is unacceptable, and something that you cannot allow. At that point, then, I think you prefer our side again, because we tell you that we make these small changes that actually happen and are much more feasible on our side. When that happens, every change is a miracle. It is something that we should celebrate. So everything that we do here is important. The framework question, which is the fourth one, is how do you differentiate? We think ultimately this is about how movements decide to organize themselves, which is to say that movements will choose to do things like focus on policies rather than on principle. Because they give an example in their other rebuttal speech, which is if you are a worker in a rural town and someone says, I will give you a job versus I will give you the ability that everyone should work in America, I think it's better that you make that assertion that you will give them a job, something that you can actually prove that you will do, a promise that you can always fulfill, and something that doesn't just give hope without any recourse underneath this. So I want to talk about, finally, the different points of this debate and why we think you should ultimately side with opposition here. We think that in the best case scenario, we recognize that there are huge challenges no matter what happens. But on our side, we've proven two things to you. Firstly, that we protect those on the margins. We think that when our leaders of movements are held accountable and have to propose policies and concrete examples of what they're going to do, it means they are held accountable and we do not end up in social movements that do not represent those who are a part of it. That is incredibly critical for the round. The other thing we talk about is excitement. I think excitement is not the most important thing insofar as if you are being dehumanized, if you are being hurt constantly by the circumstances of your existence, you are not going to be worried about whether or not you are being excited. It is something that you should be out. It's something that we should all strive to be excited about regardless of what the movement is telling us. Social justice is not optional for the people in society. The other thing is the principle. We tell you at the beginning that you should not increase the dehumanization. I am told you to imagine what it would be like to ask people to go out and use their bodies as a means to make change in society. It is an extremely high burden to do and to ask people to perform. When that is the case, you should be totally sure and convicted that what you are fighting for is feasible, tangible, and will make a difference once you get to the other side of that bridge. We think that ultimately on our side of the house, we give you that proof. The last thing I want to talk about, two last things I want to talk about, they give you the examples of how rebellions can make change. We think this is necessarily true, but it's also the case that things like feminism, in which people said that the leaders were apathetic, have led to great changes in subsequent waves and have led to great changes for those, even if they were not initially involved. We think that ultimately here, it is important to mention that each change in the circumstance of human beings is radical, and each one that we can achieve is valuable, is invaluable, I would argue, and for all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you all for listening today. Thank you.
That's all from us tonight. I want to extend one final thank you to Lillian, Daniel, Sam, and Caleb for great speeches and a thought-provoking discussion. I encourage you all to reflect upon what was said and have a wonderful night. Thank you, everyone.